Missions and women. Aside from work on evangelicals, the greatest amount of recent historical work on a subgroup in Protestant missions has been on women. Since the late 19th century, women have constituted a numerical majority in the mission field, and in all denominational traditions they have dominated educational and social work, as well as mission support in local churches. In terms of the transmission of American culture abroad, the role of missionary women has been paramount. Although the early 20th century saw a massive amount written by women on women and missions, little of this penetrated the male-dominated history profession. The bias toward intellectual history also kept the contributions of missionary women hidden from view because women tended to produce popular writing. Once again, missiologist R. Pierce Beaver pioneered the way for historians when he wrote All Love's Excelling, American Protestant Women in World Mission, an institutional history of the woman's missionary movement. Beaver's book reflected his bias toward Christian unity, and therefore concentrated on women in the mainline churches and the movement toward ecumenism. Consequently, there was no reference to 20th century evangelical or Pentecostal women in the first edition. A revised edition issued in 1980 claimed that the women's missionary movement was the first feminist movement in North America, but failed to define feminism or put the material into the context of women's history. Beaver's volume is still useful as an institutional overview of 19th and early 20th century mainline women in mission. By the late 1970s, feminist historians had begun to appreciate the importance of studying missionary women for understanding gender relations in America. As a popular movement involving millions of women, the women's missionary movement became a filter through which women historians could analyze the roles of Protestant women in America. Barbara Welter opened the topic with her essay, She Hath Done What She Could: Protestant Women's Missionary Careers in 19th Century America. Welter argued that although women's careers as missionaries were varied and fulfilling, mission careers for women typified the phenomenon whereby men abandoned an occupation to women when they lost interest in it. In 1980, Joan Jacobs Brumberg issued a study of the Judson family, Adoniram and his three wives, and Sarah and Emily. Adoniram and Judson were the pioneer missionaries of the Congregationalists and later the Baptists. Although Brumberg's group biography was an important social study of evangelicalism, its chief importance was in showing how missionary wives as role models contributed to the self-understanding of American Protestant women. In 1984, Jane Hunter forcefully demonstrated the value of examining women missionaries as representatives of American female culture in a doctoral dissertation book. Relying on the correspondence and journals of mainline China missionaries, Hunter uncovered how female missionaries were representative of the struggle of middle-class Protestant women between public outreach and private home life. Women missionaries were the most successful emissaries of American culture abroad. Continuing the exploration of missionary women as civilizers or promoters of Western culture and social change, Leslie A. Fleming in 1989 edited a volume on women missionaries and social change in Asia. The largest contingent of American Protestant women abroad in the early 19th century were the Congregational missionary women in Hawaii. The Hawaii women were in a unique position to reproduce New England female culture in a controlled setting where it could be studied, and ample documentation through correspondence exists. Studies of these women began to appear in the 1980s. Char Miller discussed the impact of domestic responsibilities on their missionary work in domesticity abroad. Work and Family in the Sandwich Island Mission, 1820 to 1840. A book-length examination of the stresses and strains of missionary life, particularly of enforced domesticity and gender discrimination, appeared in 1989 by Patricia Grimshaw. The most recent and well-nuanced examination of the Hawaiian missionary wives, particularly sensitive to their religious motivations, was Mary Zweep's 1991 study of the first group of Congregational missionary women. Consideration of the home base of the woman's missionary movement began with the publication of a book by Patricia Hill, the first in-depth analysis of the mainline women's missionary movement at its height. Hill argued that the success of the women's missionary movement was based on its gender-based ideology, and the collapse of the movement occurred when professionalization and secularization undercut its distinctive rationale. The most important inter-Protestant women's organization at the height of the missionary movement was undoubtedly the Young Women's Christian Association. The history of the missionary wing of the YWCA was ably chronicled by Nancy Boyd. Gender analysis from a conservative evangelical perspective first appeared in 1988, when Ruth Tucker produced a biographical history of women's missions. Although Guardians of the Great Commission was anecdotal rather than systematic, it contained helpful observations on domesticity, gender relations, and mission theory scattered throughout the biographical sketches. The greatest significance of Tucker's book was that it was the first book on women in mission to cover 20th-century evangelical women. Denominational historians have produced material of quality on women and missions in their own tradition. Noteworthy among these are studies of missionary women in the Southern Baptist, Episcopal, Presbyterian, United Methodist, Congregational, and Canadian Methodist denominations. A number of denominational women's organizations have issued popular books containing biographical sketches of prominent missionaries or home-based leaders. One of the most illuminating biographical studies of women leaders at the home base is Louise A. Catton's treatment of Helen Barrett Montgomery and Lucy Waterbury Peabody. The two American Baptist women were important American leaders of the ecumenical women's missionary movement in the 20th century. The discovery of women missionaries by feminist historians has been a valuable contribution to American history. Analysis of women missionaries permits study in a microcosm of self-conscious, articulate groups of women who either deliberately or despite themselves were bearers of American culture to other groups. Feminist history of the women's missionary movement has been outstanding in its sensitivity to cultural issues, even though the explanatory category of separate male and female spheres has probably been overemphasized. Missionary women represented Protestant Christianity both at its most self-denying and at its most culturally imperialistic. The weakness of the feminist history approach toward missionary women, however, parallels the weakness of nationalist mission history. Religious piety has sometimes been treated as a screen for domesticity or for social control of non-Western women, as cultural imperialism rather than being taken seriously on its own terms, thus reflecting a bias against considering religiosity as a category separate from race, class, or gender. Feminist analysis of women missionaries has concentrated on American gender identity and ideology, much as nationalist history focused on American identity. Unsurprisingly, feminist historians have studied almost exclusively mainline Protestant women during the height of the imperialist era. Except for self-avowed evangelical historians, the 20th-century conservative evangelical woman has been relegated to marginality, as retrograde in the development of the women's movement. A recent theme in women's missionary history is to move away from preoccupation with how missionaries did or did not reflect the domestic women's movement and social change, toward examination of women's motivations, piety, and mission theory both in their own right and in relation to the total missionary enterprise. Although written in different styles and for different audiences, Mary Zweep's and Ruth Tucker's aforementioned works are examples of this approach. Emphasizing a comparative approach so as to analyze how social context affected the development of women's mission thought, I have written several articles in preparation for a forthcoming history of American women's mission theory. The examination of American women's mission history by non-Westerners is another new development that promises to help historians evaluate American culture and theology from the so-called receiving end. The December 1986 issue of Indian Church History Review focused on the roles of women missionaries in India. Kwok Puilan's recently published study of Chinese women and their appropriation of Christianity is a model of how Western missionary women's materials need to be used to evaluate the missionary movement from broader perspectives than those defined by American agendas.